All right, class. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to talk about Book 1 of 1984. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the read so far. Now these are my notes. You're going to notice that my notes are very, very disorganized. So we're just going to kind of go through these points and talk about some important things. Remember that the goal of Essay 3 is to make comparisons between Orwell's novel and the real world. Basically, we're trying to answer the question, was he right or was he wrong in his prediction? And if so, why or why not? So we'll just kind of talk. Let's start with the setting of the novel. Now, we start off with Winston in Victory Flats, which is a very drab and run-down apartment complex. And you might say that the general vibe of Oceania as a country is very drab and run down and broken down. And it's almost as though by design the people are supposed to live in poverty or dilapidation. You remember the apartment smells like boiled cabbage, the windows are broken, it takes forever to fix anything, everyone's crammed in there. It's not a good place, really, not a place that you want to live. So right off the bat, Orwell presents us with a world that's drab, that's dim, that is lifeless. And remember, it's part of the theme of the dystopia, right? Dystopia being the opposite of a utopia. This is an imperfect society, a society that we don't want to live in. And likewise, Winston, as a main character, as a protagonist, is a dystopian protagonist. He's not really that likable. He's not very strong. He's very sickly. Of course, Orwell had tuberculosis at the time that he wrote this, so that probably has something to do with Winston's portrayal. But he's kind of a weak, sickly, sort of cowardly man. He's rebelling, but all of his rebellion takes place internally. It takes place in his mind, because that's the only place it can take place, right? And we know that because of everyone's paranoia that they will be outed to the powers that be, Winston can't tell anyone about his feelings or talk to anyone about anything that is unorthodox, right? And we'll get to that word later, orthodoxy. So an important question, why is Winston's apartment shaped the way that it is? Now, this is an interesting thing because Winston's apartment has that little alcove, and that little alcove kind of gives him the illusion of privacy. It lets him feel like there's a little sliver of the world where Big Brother might not be watching, right? And if you think about the layout, the alcove is protected from the view of the telescreen, which we know the telescreen is the means by which the people are watched all the time. So that's an interesting question. Like, why is his apartment shaped? Why only Winston? Why does only Winston get this little alcove? And what psychological effect might that alcove give him? It allows him, we know, to believe that maybe there's a way that he can exercise this rebellion without being caught. Another interesting thing is the scarcity and the black market, the prole shops. If you recall from the lecture, the intro lecture in 1984, we talked about the ministries, the four ministries: Ministry of Truth, Ministry of Love, Ministry of Plenty, and Ministry of Peace. Ministry of Plenty, remember the names are doublespeak, which means they are euphemisms and they actually mean the opposite of what they say. So the Ministry of Plenty is designed with instigating scarcity. Now this is an interesting thing because, you know, scarcity creates discontentment among people. If they don't have what they need, they're constantly bothered by it. And that could be beneficial for the powerful, but it could also be kind of a pain, you know, because discontented people are more likely to rebel. But in any case, Orwell believes that power over the people will be asserted by the purposeful maintenance of scarcity. So all of these things that are missing, shoelaces, razor blades, it's not as though they are impossible to get. It's that they are purposefully under-manufactured so that people are always looking for things. The interesting take that Orwell has. There's also the famous, I forget which, some Roman said it, give them bread and circuses and they'll never revolt. And the implication of that statement is that if you meet people's basic needs, they're actually less likely to revolt against you. So maybe this is backwards, but I don't know. It's an interesting idea from Orwell. And Winston is constantly looking for things. He goes into the prole shops, which is technically a no-no, but it's one of the things that you can get away with. Remember, the proles are allowed to, they're the people that are not of the party. 85% of the population of Oceania considered the lower class. They're allowed to have a black market and like basically free trade, and the party members partake, but they do so very cautiously. Also, I really like the way that Orwell uses dreams in this novel. Winston has a lot of different dreams and dream sequences. He has the dream about O'Brien, who is a member of the inner party that he is for some reason very fond of, and he has dreams about O'Brien where O'Brien says we shall meet in the place where there is no darkness, which is very cryptic and strange. He also has dreams about his mother and sister, so we kind of get a little bit of information about Winston's past, but the thing is 1984 only ever gives us a fragmented past. We never get the past in its totality because the past in its totality has been destroyed. The only thing we have are little fragments, rhymes that have been passed down, a dream that Winston has from when he was a little kid. Maybe a fragment, like the diary, a piece of the past, an object that suggests that things used to be different but doesn't exactly tell you how. And the dreams are part of this fragmentation. It's very interesting. So think about the way that Orwell uses the dream sequence and what he might be saying about that. Now, the diary, I have here the diary is the locus of disobedience. I'm being a very, very fancy with my wording there. The diary itself represents the old world. It is a thing of beauty. Nothing in Winston's world is manufactured for aesthetic purposes or for the purpose of beauty. It's all just kind of utilitarian and in the most basic and usually ineffectual way. So to have the diary, a piece of the past like this, as the center of his rebellion, the place, the little niche that he can carve out in the world when he's sitting in that alcove, he can actually write his true thoughts in that diary. Now we know that if he ever gets caught with this diary, he's a dead man, literally. So right from the start we have, and it doesn't even seem like a big transgression, but the act of writing in the diary is enough to get Winston killed. So the diary is an interesting symbol. It's an interesting, I kicked something. It's an interesting symbol in the story because diaries, of course, that's where you exercise your thoughts. That's where you use the written language. We know that Orwell made a big connection between the written language and the ability to think or the ability to rebel against the status quo. So it's an interesting sign. It's an interesting symbol. And it's part of this fragment of history. The next thing we have is Victory Gin. Poor Winston, he's got a bit of an alcohol problem, which doesn't surprise us given that his life is so unfulfilling and monotonous and miserable. The gin is kind of one of the only comforts he has, but it's not really a comfort. It's very numbing. It's very oily and nasty tasting. And it's just meant to deaden you and to kind of turn off your discontent for a while. Victory Gin, also interesting that it's named Victory. What is this obsession with victory, this obsession with dominance that we see throughout the text? It's really very interesting. Do we have that kind of obsession with dominance today, like where we're calling, can you imagine going to the store and buying Victory orange juice? Maybe it's a little far-fetched, but, nothing would surprise me at this point. Okay, so the forced exercise, we have the calisthenics where like Winston has to get up and do jumping jacks at the behest of the telescreen. This is very interesting because you can see that every little aspect of his life is controlled. From the time he wakes up to the time he goes to bed at night, there's a strict regimen and schedule. And if he deviates from that even a little bit, he's either brought into check or he arouses suspicion, and that suspicion could be enough to get him killed. So you see just the extent to where Winston's freedom is non-existent, right? He's even has to get up out of bed first thing in the morning and do a bunch of jumping jacks to get the blood flowing. Maybe good for his personal health, but we would hope that Winston would be able to make that decision on his own if that's something he wants to do. So we have the motto of Oceania, which is war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. These are like this is like doublespeak. It's like the opposite. We're supposed to believe and that these paradoxes are true. And this is the way that the people of the party are supposed to believe. They're supposed to accept paradox. Well, how can war be peace? Well, you don't ask questions. You just accept it. War is peace. Without war, we wouldn't have peace. Wait, what a minute? Well, how does that work? Don't ask, right? That's the party's take on that. You don't ask questions. You just accept, and you accept moment to moment. You do not reconcile contradiction, right? So we also have in Orwell's text talk about a class stratification, or like class, I don't know, warfare. That's kind of a loaded term, but you do have like the three the three layers of class in the society. The biggest are the proles, which is short for proletariat. It's a word that is related to Marxist theory, meaning the working class. So the proles are the working class. They represent 85% of the people of Oceania, and they are largely uncontrolled because the government doesn't have to control them. Orwell seems to suggest that the reason the government doesn't have to control them is because they don't really have the mind for challenging them, which may be kind of an elitist commentary on Orwell's part, which I'm perfectly fine discussing because, you know, as intelligent as he is a human being and susceptible to fault. So maybe he's wrong about the proles, but the proles are basically free. They're unregulated by the party for the most part. They're allowed to do whatever they want, but they don't do anything meaningful with their time or with their energy. They are constantly distracted and really unaware, right? Then there are the members of the party. Now, these people are a little bit smarter and more capable, but they are the most controlled people in the society. The party members are every move. It's like Winston. Every move is watched. Every toe you put out of line, there's a punishment for it. So that's another percentage, probably about, I would say, 10% of the population is in the party. And then you have the inner party, which is a very small percent, maybe 5% of the population. And those people are the ones that run the show. Now, as a reward for running the show, they get luxuries. They have nice apartments. They have access to wine and things like that. So they really are like the upper class, but they are the ones that run the government and basically make all the decisions. Another interesting concept, which we mentioned the other day, but thought crime. In Orwell's world of 1984, Oceania, you don't go to jail for the action. You don't get arrested for the action. You get arrested for the thought. So imagine you're sitting there and you think about stealing a candy bar from the store. Well, the thought of stealing a candy bar from the store is not enough to get you in trouble. You may ask, why am I having this kind of thought? This is a very dishonest thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are guilty of the action. However, when you think something in Orwell's world, you are guilty of the action. So the question is, when did Winston doom himself? When did he become guilty of thought crime? Was it when he wrote in the diary? Was it before that? Was it when he bought the diary? Or was it when he had the thought that he should go into the store to buy the diary? It's hard to pin it down, but in any case, this is a really weird concept because we very much have the idea that you're innocent until proven guilty, and that the thought doesn't matter. It's how you act. And there are some areas where that complicates a little bit. You can be an accessory and things like that. But for the most part, you can think whatever you want. As long as you don't carry it out in our world, you're not guilty of it. But in Orwell's world, that's not the case. The thought is the crime. And since there are no laws, it's any thought which goes against the orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy is ever changing. It can change from minute to minute. So you can imagine this is a very exhausting climb to live in because you constantly have to adapt and change and keep up with the status quo. So it's an interesting question. When did Winston commit the first thought crime? What do you make of the description of the pictures, meaning the films? He goes to a film and he writes about it in his diary, and it's really just gratuitous violence, like people getting mowed down in the street and just horrible things. Why is there such a violence obsession? Do we share this in our modern world? Think about like all the violent video games or like obsessions with certain like combat sports and stuff, MMA, which I'm not knocking, but I'm just asking the question. MMA, football, that kind of thing. What is it with the infatuation with violence? Is violence Is it all bad? Is it bad in a certain context? And what commentary do you think Orwell is making about the violence? Obviously, the people in Orwell's society are totally desensitized to violence. They see it as normal and they get excited by it. So that's an interesting thing. Why would the powerful want people to be violent? Is it because then they can better convince them to go to war and that kinds of thing? But it's a really barbaric scene with the people getting shot and stuff in the little boat. So I won't go too much more into that. But think about that. Why are all of the films in Orwell's world about gratuitous violence and war and in glorification of these things? Very interesting. Um, O'Brien, the character O'Brien. We see the character O'Brien. He's a very stout, stern fellow, very calm and seemingly put together. But Winston has a strange connection with O'Brien. He feels a connection to him, and he feels that O'Brien knows what he's thinking and maybe even sympathizes with what he's thinking. So it's an interesting relationship. Why does he trust O'Brien? What reason does he have to trust O'Brien? Is it that O'Brien looks like Big Brother and Big Brother is in Winston's mind all the time? Or is it that he really does actually have sympathy for Winston and want to help him and want to bring him in as part of the Brotherhood? Interesting. What do you think of O'Brien? I've already covered the next one. Does scarcity make people easier to control or more difficult to control? Interesting question. Then we have Goldstein and the 2 minutes hate. So Emmanuel Goldstein, we mentioned this in the intro lecture. That is I said Goldstein. Geez, I misspelled that. That is, I believe that's a traditionally Jewish name, so there may be some commentary on anti-Semitism here, which we know through World War II was very common, and Orwell had witnessed it. But he's like the number one, like the enemy of the state, the enemy of the people. He's like an Osama bin Laden type character, right? Just somebody that's just the boogeyman. Not to say that Osama bin Laden wasn't really the boogeyman, but he had that role in the people's minds as like a boogeyman or like somebody that was out to get everyone and lurking around every corner and that kind of thing. So what is the effect of that? Like, why do you think Goldstein is really out there, like organizing an army against Big Brother? And if so, like, why do they have recordings of him that they use in the 2 minutes hate? The 2 minutes hate is an interesting concept too. They gather all the people in the room and put Emmanuel Goldstein on the TV screen, and then everyone like foams at the mouth and jumps up and down and goes crazy. This weird catharsis and violent outpouring. And it's like the party wants them to be always in a frenzy against the enemy and always looking out for thought criminals and the agents of Goldstein. And it's a very panicked, strange moment where people become animals, basically. And they start bleeding like sheep and jumping up and down and foaming at the mouth. It's very, very strange. And it reminds me, I lived through the 9/11 stuff, and I remember like the videos of bin Laden kind of had a 2 minutes hate quality. It's like whenever the population would lull in their enthusiasm for the war, maybe it was just coincidence, but there would always be a bin Laden video that would reignite everyone's concern that this guy was still out there and he was still at large and we had to bring him to justice. Of course we did, and again, don't read into what I'm saying like a bin Laden wasn't a problem, but I'm noting the comparison. I'm noting the parallels between the sort of use of bin Laden to further agenda-based things. Okay. What do you make of Parsons' children? So Winston goes over to Mrs. Parsons' apartment, and he has to fix the sink, and these little children are just awful. They're at him. They're hit him with a catapult, talking about turning him in, thought criminals. The Society of Oceania makes a point to indoctrinate children and to make them into basically servants of the party. So what does that mean? Why children? Are they impressionable? Do they internalize things into adulthood? Because the children are very much indoctrinated, even against their own parents, which is a big deal. Altering the past. So Winston's job, he works at the Ministry of Truth, and he basically changes the past to fit the needs of the party. One of the things that he alters is stuff about, he has to make up stories sometimes, or he has to change things. In the end of, I think it's chapter 4, he talks about Comrade Ogilvy, and he makes up a story about this guy that never existed, and he was such a good party member. He died for the party, laid everything down. He never committed an unorthodox thought, and he's proud of himself. Winston likes his job, but being in that position where you know that everything is a lie because you're the one creating the lies, it puts Winston in a unique position in terms of his ability to see, to read between the lines and to see what the party's actually doing. So maybe his job isn't actually working out in his favor, right? There's the concept of an unperson or being vaporized. What does it mean to disappear completely? People just disappear. They just get black bagged, vaporized, and then no one's ever supposed to mention them again. So, you know, even if you are able to convince people that you are right, once you disappear, the fear that that will happen to them is enough to shut most people up, right? So there's the concept of being an unperson or being vaporized, as Winston says. And he's always trying to figure out who will be vaporized and who will survive. Then I have schlop in the canteen. The food is really terrible. There's nothing pleasurable, really, about Winston's existence in the sensory sense. He doesn't get good food. He doesn't, you know, and there's no real outlet for sensory happiness in Orwell's world at all. And the schlop in the canteen is like a brown gravy with spongy meat in it that he hopes is meat. So yeah, that's an interesting detail. The character Syme, who works on the Newspeak Dictionary, he's a philologist. He basically works on shortening the language on behalf of the party, but he understands too much. And so Winston actually says Syme is one of the people that will be vaporized because Syme is too much of a danger. He's too aware of the party's motivations and why they want things to be a certain way. And he talks about his interest in Newspeak, and he seems very invested, and he seems actually very loyal to the party and very orthodox, but it doesn't matter. It's his intelligence that makes him a threat, and so Winston knows that he will be vaporized. And the relationship between Syme and Winston is very interesting. They're almost friends, but not really. It's like anyone that you could consider your friend could backstab you at any moment, and Syme is no different. A couple of quotes from Syme. The proles are not human beings, showing the attitude that party members have towards most of the population, a very elitist approach. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness. Brings me back to that word of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy means that which is considered the standard or the norm. So orthodoxy is the norm, heterodoxy is that which is abnormal. So in order to go by the norm, you have to be unconscious, unaware. That's an interesting idea, right? And that kind of makes Syme screwed because he is very aware and he's not unconscious. So then how could he be orthodox? There's also the idea of duck speak. We have this character in the canteen that's just like quacking away all of this propaganda about Big Brother and all this stuff. And it just shows you the mindlessness by which people repeat orthodoxy and repeat what they believe. If you want to see this in the real world, just follow the media cycles. What ridiculous thing happened yesterday? That's what everyone's talking about. Does it have any pertinence to your life or to the situation that we're in? No, but everyone's still talking about it because it's what's on TV. It's what's been deemed important as the orthodoxy, right? Okay. We already mentioned that Syme will be vaporized. He's too smart. There's the Chestnut Tree Cafe. So like the Chestnut Tree Cafe kind of represents the arts in their very limited capacity to exist in Orwell's world. And even though they're allowed to exist in this way, if you go to the Chestnut Tree Cafe, you're one of those people, right? There's something up. You're doing something, right? And so it's kind of a place where even though you can enjoy the arts and the finer things, it still arouses a bit of suspicion. So Parsons is an interesting character. We met his wife earlier, but Parsons is like the sort of stubby gentleman who's very, very orthodox and very much and believes in the party and organizes for Hate Week and God, I love my children and how awful they are and aren't they good little buggers? They're dedicated. He is the ultimate orthodox person. He's completely unconscious. He's very gross and sweaty and all these unpleasant, but Winston knows Parsons will never be vaporized because Parsons is too orthodox, or so orthodox that he has a strange pride in his children's, I say sociopathy. I'm not even sure if that's the right word. I always, sociopath, psychopath, I mix it all up. But yeah, interesting that he would be proud of them for being basically little monsters, right? In the canteen, there's the ministry announcements about the sugar rations and stuff, and that just shows you doublethink. They can be presented with a contradiction, and they just don't reconcile it. They don't reconcile paradox. They don't reconcile contradiction. They just accept whatever the party says is true in the moment. All right, page 2, moving right along. So the Prostitute Encounter, I think that's in chapter 6. I could be wrong. Could be 7. The prostitute encounter is very interesting because it shows the limited capacity with which the sexual instinct can be exercised in Oceania. It can only be exercised in a repressed and corrupted form. There's nothing about this encounter that is pleasant for Winston, maybe on some sensory level, but it is also very like corrupted in that way as well. There's no intimacy between him and this person. It's completely transactional, and it's basically just to relieve an instinct. And so Orwell thinks that in that capacity, the party would allow sexuality. What they really don't want is intimacy or connection to be forged between people, because if enough people make connections, they can form alliances and become a problem, right? So it's interesting how Orwell treats sexuality. It's very different than Aldous Huxley's take in his dystopian text called Brave New World. He believes that the government would stimulate sexuality because if you're sexually satisfied, you're very easy to control. You don't complain very much. But Orwell's take was different. He thinks they want you sexually repressed so that you don't make meaningful connections. And also because that repression eventually translates into violence, and they want you to be violent. Interesting idea. No, I'm not sure if he's right, but it's an interesting idea. The makeup, she's a parole woman, so she's allowed to wear makeup, and he's attracted to it. Party women can't wear makeup, so that's an interesting commentary. Prostitution is illegal, but yet it's like weirdly encouraged or kind of allowed. They look the other way. You won't get killed for prostitution. You'll get sent to a work camp, which is not much better, but it's not quite as bad. We had the mention of Catherine and Winston's wife, and we see how marriage works in 1984. Marriage works as a very practical thing. It is for children, right? To the production of children. There's no other purpose for marriage. People are, if it's seen that you're attracted to a person or that you might like them, you're not allowed to get married. All marriages are sort of defined by the party. So that's an interesting concept as well. And we see that he doesn't love his wife at all. They really don't get along. He can't stand her company. Eventually it becomes apparent that they're never going to have a kid, so they just part ways. And he doesn't even know if she's alive anymore, right? Kind of sad, because the way we view marriage in the modern times, that you should do it for love and friendship and compatibility and all that stuff. Not so in 1984. They don't want that intimacy between people. So Winston considers sex the ultimate act of rebellion. Very interesting, because it's really a basic human instinct and a basic human necessity. But in this repressive society, this totalitarian environment, it becomes this rebellious act, this act of rebellion and self-definition. Very interesting concept. He also believes if there is any hope, it comes from the proles, which, remember, they're 85% of the population. And he thinks that if the proles would just become conscious of how powerful they were and how much strength they really had, then the government of Oceania would be unable to resist them. But then we have the example, I call it the Saucepan Rebellion, where he thinks he hears a riot and he goes around the corner and it's just a bunch of prole women arguing over saucepans that they're trying to buy from a black market shop. So they don't seem to have a concern for political stuff. They only care about their own immediate needs and sort of getting through the scarcity and sort of dealing with their poverty. They don't see the forest for the trees, so to speak. The system and how the system works, these thoughts do not occur to the proles. So then the question is, how could they ever really revolt? And this is an interesting idea that Orwell keeps bringing up. If the masses would get tired of it, they could have whatever system they wanted, but they seem to not really consider it at all. He reads the history book, which talks about the capitalists and the emphasis of the top hat. It's almost like the Monopoly guy. He represents a capitalist and the caricature of a capitalist. And there's all this stuff. Some of it is true. We hear about yeah, they did kind of control everything and own the means of production and stuff. But then the jus prime noctis and all of that stuff, that's not really true. So we see from the history book that history is mingled with half-truths. And the half-truths are indistinguishable from the lies, right? So it's hard for Winston to even know, is the past really the way they say it is? Was it really worse back then, or was it better? And how would I know, right? because the past is always changing. That's what Orwell calls the mutability of history. We always change the past. And we have these three characters, Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, I believe is their names. And Winston saw a picture of these people long after they were supposed to be made unpersons. So they're not supposed to exist, and he sees a picture which proves they exist. So he had in his hands concrete, tangible proof that the party lies. And so he knows the party lies and the party changes history. And so history must be different from what the party says it is, but he doesn't know how because there's no way for him to tell. Every piece of history that he ever gets is just a fragment. It's a photograph, it's a diary, it's a nursery rhyme, little pieces, fragments of the past. He can't put it all together, and so how can he really tell? So he goes and tries to find out, right? He goes into the parole side of town. Also, when we hear about Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, we get the rhyme about under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me. Again, another fragment of history, completely out of context, completely out of place, but it has some weird relationship to that site, the Chestnut Tree Cafe, as a site of taboo or rebellious people. When he walks through the parole side of town, a bomb drops and there's a bloody hand on the ground. He just kicks it into the gutter, again showing you his just complete lack of concern for violence. Violence is normal. Bombs fall, that's normal. He sees the lottery and the proles' obsession with the lottery and how the prizes are mostly fake, but the proles, they just devote all their time to the lottery. It's like an obsession, and they can't get over it. They can't see around it. And if they would just take that energy and devote it to something meaningful, maybe we could have a better world. But no, they're distracted, right? The lottery is what's important. So eventually we get to the bar, and Winston tries to speak to the parole man there, but he can't really get anything useful out of him. The guy can't remember anything that's not just about petty quarrels and his own personal desires and things that happened to him in the past, but he doesn't give him any information about the system or how the system worked. And I have to ask the question, is this an elitist message on the part of Orwell? Is this him saying, like, people are just not there enough mentally to lead a conscious revolution or something like that? Maybe. It's kind of depressing, but it's nevertheless a problem that Winston hits over and over again. He can't get any information out of the proles that's meaningful, but he still believes in them, strangely enough. Mr. Charrington, we were in Mr. Charrington's shop. We bought the diary, but we returned to it at the end of book one, which was really a dumb thing to do because he shouldn't have gone there to begin with, and he definitely shouldn't have returned. And once he did return, he definitely should not have bought something else or talked to Mr. Charrington or any of this stuff. But he does. He purchases a paperweight, which is a glass bobule with a little piece of coral in it. And it's interesting how this object also represents something else in the novel, right? The coral is what Winston wants. He wants his own little life. He wants his pretty little bubble with this pretty little piece of coral inside, and it's his little life, and that's what he wants more than anything. And they have a term for it, actually. They call it own life. You want your own life, and if you're looking for own life, you're actually a heroine. Don't want it around, but Winston can't help it, and he buys this paperweight because it's beautiful and it represents the past when they made things just because they were pretty and no other reason, which they don't do anymore. So it tells him something, and it gives him a little bit more of the piece of the puzzle, but we still don't know exactly what it was like, right? Was it better? Was it worse? Was it the same? Was it better and worse? He can't really tell. On the way home from the store, he notices the dark-haired girl is following him, and this terrifies him. He imagines hitting her with a cobblestone or the paperweight. So we see the level at which violence is ingrained in him. As soon as he sees a girl that he knows following him around, he thinks, "Oh, I've got to crush her. I've got to kill her." Right? This is just the way that they want him. They want him in this violent, frenzied state. And even though he's a rebellious person, he still is susceptible to what the party wants him to think and what they want him to do. They want him to fear this person. So he starts to think, if she hands me in, I'll kill myself instead of going in. It's very depressing. He thinks about suicide. He's got all this fear of torture, and he knows that he's kind of a dead man, but he's got it in his head that somehow it'll work out. He'll pull the plug before he has to go in or something like that. And this girl is what he believes is the one to do it. He thinks she might be an amateur spy or maybe even a member of the thought police. Ooh, because remember, we don't know who the thought police are. It could be anybody. So maybe it is this girl, and he's seen her before. It's like she's been stalking him. She sat near him in the canteen and stuff, so he's starting to get nervous. He's starting to think that maybe he's under scrutiny from someone. And we know that people just hand people in all the time. Children hand in their parents. People hand in random strangers for wearing the wrong things. So it's a very real fear that he has, and he doesn't know what she really wants, right? Let's see. So he also remembers O'Brien's thing. We will meet in the place where there is no darkness. He has a strange fixation on O'Brien. He considers the diary that he's writing as being written to O'Brien as a kind of confession, but also because he believes that O'Brien has sympathy for him and thinks the way he does, which is strange because we know that O'Brien is a member of the inner party. So how could this be so? He locked eyes with him at the 2 minutes hate, and it's like they had that telepathic communication. But was that real? How many times have you looked at someone's eyes? I mean, you lock eyes with people in public. Do you really know what they're thinking? You think you might know what they're thinking, but do you really know? Right? How could you really know? So it's a weird question. And why does he trust O'Brien just because of such a brief encounter, just a look in the eyes, right? And so we end the last chapter in book 1 with Winston staring at the coin and reading the motto: "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." So it's kind of like this reassertion of the party philosophy at the end of book 1. It's like a weird way to bookend his rebellion. It's like even though he's done all these rebellious things, he still feels under the banner of this slogan and just trapped by the reality that he lives in. So that takes care of book 1. Those are most of the points that I want to talk about. Comparisons to our real world. I mean, obviously we're surveilled domestically. We're watched by the government. We're watched by corporations. We're watched by foreign governments. Your information is gathered. Your data is gathered. Your search history is kept. Portfolios are built on you, and your desires are predicted based on these models and stuff. There is like constant warfare, but it's not really on our front. We do have propaganda. We have, I mentioned kind of the 2 minutes hate sort of phenomena, right? In a way, the history is mutable. The past is always changing. A lot of what the past changing today has to do with just like forgetting that something is important and moving on to the next thing, right? So it's not, and that reminds me of the memory hole, which I didn't mention, but Winston has this thing called the memory hole, where if you want to get rid of something, you just drop it down the memory hole and it goes away. So think about it. Do we have a memory hole? Do we just get rid of stuff once it's no longer serving us, once the media cycle is up, right? And that's another good question. So just think about making comparisons. Remember, they don't have to be direct comparisons. They can be like, well, Orwell was worried about this, and this is kind of like this, or you can say that he was wrong, right? You don't have to say that he was right. But think about making comparisons between the novel and the real world, especially with regards to technology today and the absence of privacy and all this stuff. I think it's a really a big problem. And also, who defines reality? You know, who decides what's true? We live in a world now where different media factions seem to be living in alternate realities. How do we know which reality is real, right? How do we navigate that minefield? You know, it's almost as difficult as Winston trying to navigate the reality of what's real and what isn't based on his knowledge, his personal knowledge, and how that compares to what the party tells him and what most other people believe. And it can be really frustrating, right? You can feel like you don't even really know what's going on. And that can be a scary feeling. So I feel like I've talked a little bit too much on this one. I'm just going to leave it at that. We will, of course, talk about many of these issues in the next couple of videos, so please keep an eye out for those. And have an excellent week, and please email me with any questions.